This is a quick video explaining how to use heuristics to test the usability of your web design. First, what are heuristics? They're a fancy word for rules of thumb for usability. Effectively, they're questions used for testing a website to see how usable it is. One of the most famous set of heuristics was the 10 usability heuristics for user interface design, written by the Nielsen-Norman Group way back in 1994. This forms the basis for most heuristics. First, there is the visibility of system status. The system status means letting the user know what is happening behind the scenes. Showing the system status can involve loading bars, pages thanking the user for filling in a form, levels of stock availability. It lets the user know that the system isn't broken. Next, we have the match between the system and the real world. This means always use language that is familiar to the user. If the user can't understand the words used on your site, they're not going to be able to effectively use your site. Use design conventions that are familiar to the user. This may mean using skeuomorphism. Skeuomorphism meaning that it mimics items in the real world. And you can use skeuomorphism where appropriate to mimic the real world if it helps the user understand how to use the system. A classic example is sticky notes on a computer, or even the iPhone library, the iBooks. When that first came out, it actually looked like a bookshelf on your iPhone. Next, we have user control and freedom. If a user makes a mistake, there should be an easy way out, or an easy way to undo it, or an easy way to repeat an action if it was correct. Undo and redo are very good examples of user control and freedom. Consistency and standards. Your design symbols, interaction elements and wording should be consistent from page to page. A user should not have to wonder if the same wording or symbol does a different thing on a different page. And you'll notice this on well-designed websites. If they're using one particular color button to encourage you to do a particular action, they will use the same type of button from page to page. Really importantly, error prevention. There are two types of errors. Slips, where the user intends on doing one action but ends up doing another, for example, a typo, and mistakes, where the user is attempting an action that isn't appropriate for their goal or task. The latter is an example where the mental model does not match the user interface design. The first is an example where interactions are too easily confused. This can have serious consequences. A lack of error prevention in a design caused a huge panic in 2018 when a missile alert system erroneously sent out a missile alert to residents and tourists in the Hawaiian Islands. It was a drill, but the message was sent live to mobile phones across Hawaii rather than to a test network it was meant for. Apparently, the mistake was human error, and the human erred twice. Once when they selected the wrong choice, and the second time when they confirmed the previous selection. The mistakes are often due to miscues, where design conventions are used inappropriately or incorrectly to poorly differentiated options. There may also be problematic presentation or interaction design and a lack of confirmation for destructive actions. So this is the error. This is the system that caused that huge error. And you can see how similar the choices are here. Further compounding the human error was the fact there was no option for false alarm to recall or correct the mistake. So people were left for hours thinking they were facing imminent doom. Another issue that is tested with heuristics is recognition rather than recall. There is a famous web design book called Don't Make Me Think. It can be difficult for a user to memorize something from one page to the next. Give them direct instructions at the point at which they need to do the action. Memory is divided into chunks or basic interconnected units. These chunks are then activated or recalled by practice, recency, or context. A good user interface design will not force people to memorize information. It will present it when it is needed. Flexibility and efficiency of use. Accelerators can speed up actions for expert users, but they should not get in the way of beginners. So the image on the screen currently is the keyboard shortcuts for using Twitter. Now, I didn't even know there were keyboard shortcuts for using Twitter, which shows how infrequently I use Twitter. But for people who use it all the time, this speeds up their process a great deal. Aesthetic and minimalist design. So as Moran says, a minimalist web design strategy is one that seeks to simplify interfaces by removing unnecessary elements or content that does not support user tasks. Don't use redundant information. Each bit of information has to compete with other information on the page for attention. This can distract the user from important elements elsewhere. An analysis of 112 minimalist websites in 2015 revealed that the defining features of minimalism were flat design, limited colour schemes, few user interface elements, the use of negative space, and dramatic typography. So remember, when we're talking about minimalism, it's not a stylistic choice. It is effectively removing unnecessary information and distractions. Help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So visible, does the user notice that a mistake has occurred? Explicit, what's gone wrong? For example, you have not included a location for the meeting. Do you wish to add one before sending the meeting invitation? Human readable language. An error of type 2 has occurred doesn't mean much to the average person, so you need to phrase it so that they understand what's going on. Polite phrasing. Do not suggest that the error is the user's fault or because they are stupid. For instance, illegal operation can actually panic some people who aren't used to computer systems. Help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. Continued. Precision. Descriptions of exact problems rather than vague generalities such as syntax error. Constructive advice on how to fix the problem. Instead of out of stock, give the user an option to enter their email address to be alerted when the item is in stock again. Preserve as much of the user's work as possible. Don't make them re-enter everything on a form if they've entered one line item incorrectly. Reduce the work of correcting the error. Where possible, suggest the right answer. For instance, if the city doesn't match the postcode, give a list of cities to choose from. Help and documentation. While it's best for a design to be self-explanatory, sometimes you will need additional documentation to help users do their tasks. Websites such as Twitter and eBay have extensive user support for this reason. So those are the 10 heuristics written by Nielsen and Norman. How can you then use them? Heuristics are designed for expert evaluation. They're not used for target audience user testing generally. That's usually because the wording tends to be more expert, more technical, and the average person doesn't quite understand what you're looking for. But also they're there to try to give as objective a measurement of usability as possible. So they're not about user experience, the subjective experience. The idea is to actually be able to compare the level of usability of one website and another. Now, that's one set of heuristics. There are other heuristics. For instance, Cogdill cut his list down to 7 heuristics. Is there internal consistency? Does it use simple dialogue? Are there shortcuts for expert users? Does it minimize the user's memory load? Does the design prevent errors? Does the system provide feedback? And is there an internal locus of control? You also have navigation heuristics. They look specifically at navigation on a website. However, these heuristics show how easy it is for any rules to be dated. So are there orphan pages? Where do they go? Orphan pages being ones that aren't linked to anything else. Are there any long pages? And this is one that is particularly dated because this was written in 2007. Since 2014, scrolling websites have been very, very common because they're easier to use for mobile devices, which Cogdill and other heuristics writers couldn't predict 7 years in the future. Is there any guidance to help users find their way around the site? Yes. Are the menus shallow or deep? Back in the early days, a shallow menu was considered better because it took a long time for pages to load. So you didn't want them to have to click through too many pages to find what they're after. Now, with user experience being a lot more sophisticated, deep menus are often used to guide the user through a certain trail of choices, and that can create a better user experience. But you just have to match that mental model, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about navigation in a couple of weeks' time. Are links obvious in the text? Do they use a different color? Now, back in the day, that was blue. Now we can use different colors to tell people it is a link. Are menus use name and position consistency? Are links use consistency? Now, that one is still important. So as you can see, these navigation heuristics, most of them are okay. Some are actually a bit dated, which is why we want you to write your own set of heuristics so that you can update all of these to make a good set of original heuristics that can be used to test different websites. So things to remember. It's useful to research existing heuristics. They're useful as they provide a good overview of different usability considerations. Be careful not to follow them slavishly though, as they can be dated. If you are creating your own set of heuristics, make sure they are general and can be used to test usability on any website. For instance, a baking website would not have a heuristic, is it easy to follow the recipe? Because you couldn't then use that on a shopping website. Rather, it would have a question, can instructions be easily remembered and followed? Remember that heuristics are about usability, not aesthetics. A good heuristic would be, is the text easily readable? It would not be, is the font chosen aesthetically pleasing? Now, you need to write 10 heuristics for your next assessment. They are 10 questions about usability. There has to be 10 of them or you lose marks. You can use existing heuristics as a starting point. So read them to understand exactly what each of them is testing. They need to evaluate your site on key elements of usability. So use these existing heuristics as a starting point. Use them to test your site. Rate your site for each question. Don't just ask yes or no, because then if you have two websites, yours and a competitor that are both yes, you don't know which one is better. So rate them, out of 5, out of 10, doesn't matter, as long as you can then say, well, my website is a 4, this one is an 8, where does mine need to improve? Once you've written the set of 10 heuristics, you need to use them to test your site to see how your site measures up. Rate it numerically on each heuristic. Then look at competitor sites. For a really good mark, make sure it's at least 2 other competitor sites. Okay, so you need to do at least one. Do 2 or more, I would recommend, to get that HD if you're aiming for it. So rate different sites using the same set of heuristics. Rate them numerically so that you can compare them. And lastly, get another person to rate just your site using your set of heuristics. This will reveal if there are any blind spots, if you've been objective or if you've been subjective, and you can compare what they said about your site to what you said about your site. Now, you can use your mock-up. You don't have to have a working site for this because we know that you're not that far in the development process. So you can just have screenshots, your mock-ups, and people can have a look at them and then rate those. So here are some tips. Write your heuristics as questions, not statements. Focus on usability, not aesthetics, how the site functions, not what it looks like. You need to be general. Use the heuristics, if necessary, to assess the Swinburne University website and the Amazon website. If any of your questions cannot be used for those sites as well as your own, then it is not general enough for website heuristics. Make sure you rate your website and your competitors' websites for each question. So the assignment that is due, it's in class, individual presentation at your computer, 3 minutes maximum. Don't prepare a speech or anything like that. We will just talk you through it. You'll be presenting it on the online documentation that you've got. It needs to be added in there to your site builder case study. Ideally, use information graphics to compare the findings. Okay, so it's easy to just see it. I don't want to have to read a paragraph and then read another paragraph. If I ask you, how did your site rate against this competitor, you should be able to just glance at it and tell me. You shouldn't have to say, hang on, I'll just scroll back and read these 3 pages of information first. And lastly, just to reinforce, those heuristics do need to be phrased as questions. That's what heuristics are.